So, what even is business strategy? For a really long time, we thought of it as a super detailed blueprint for success. But, in today's world where everything is constantly changing, that rigid model, it's just breaking. So, let's dive into how the very definition of strategy is evolving from that static blueprint into a dynamic, adaptable compass.
But first, let's just get a quick reality check. According to the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, that number you see, that's the percentage of new businesses that fail within their first 5 years. Yeah, almost half. It's a pretty staggering number when you stop and think about it.
And of course, that brings up the big question. Why? Why is this happening? What is going so wrong for so many smart entrepreneurs and even big established companies? It's a question that really gets to the heart of what it means to run a business in the first place.
Look, this isn't just some question for a business school class. It's a real fundamental problem of survival. And when you start to dig into the reasons behind all these failures, a very clear pattern starts to show up. The research points to a whole list of usual suspects, right? Things like poor planning or, building something that nobody actually wants, or just not being able to adapt when the world shifts under your feet. But what's really fascinating is that all of these things, planning, market need, focus, they all point back to one single core concept: strategy. So, for decades, the answer to this whole survival problem was this formal, super structured approach called strategic management. This was the classic blueprint, that master plan that was supposed to guide a company safely into the future. And this isn't a new idea at all. The whole discipline of strategic management goes way back to the 1950s and 60s. Thinkers like Peter Drucker and Alfred Chandler, they were the ones who pioneered this idea that companies needed a long-term, coordinated strategy to give them direction. And by the 60s, having a formal strategic planning department was just what big companies did. Okay, so what did that actually mean? Well, the classic definition is really about two things: formulation and implementation. Basically, you analyze everything around you, you set your big goals, and then you figure out how you're going to get there. It's a very logical, very analytical process. Alfred Chandler, one of the pioneers of this whole field, he just put it perfectly back in 1962. Strategy is all about setting those long-term goals and then lining up the actions and the resources you need to hit them. See? It's a blueprint drawn up way in advance. So the really crucial point here is that this traditional model is a very linear two-step process. First, you think, you plan, you analyze, you decide. That's formulation. Then, and only after that's done, you execute. You get your people and your money moving to implement the plan. Thinking first, doing second. Simple as that. But here's where the story takes a turn. What happens when the world you so carefully planned for changes overnight? What happens when your perfect blueprint leads you right off a cliff? This right here is the central conflict in modern business strategy. This quote from the entrepreneur Steve Blank just absolutely nails it. No business plan survives first contact with customers. That is such a powerful idea. It basically says that all that careful, upfront planning, well, it might just be fiction until it actually meets reality. And this just brilliantly illustrates the problem, doesn't it? For any new venture, whether it's a startup or a new product inside a huge company, you are operating under what Eric Ries famously calls conditions of extreme uncertainty. And in that kind of environment, a rigid, detailed plan isn't a guide to success. It's a recipe for disaster. Here's the fundamental flaw in that old model. It assumes you already have the answers. It assumes you know exactly who your customer is, what their problems are, and what solution they're willing to pay for. But for innovators, those aren't facts. They're just guesses. They're hypotheses that have to be tested, not orders to be executed. So if the blueprint is broken, what's the alternative? Well, the answer is a whole new way of thinking, one that treats strategy not as some static map, but as a dynamic compass, something to help you navigate all that uncertainty. And this is what we call the lean solution. Let's just look at this shift side by side. Traditional management is all about elaborate planning, often based on intuition, and then executing in a straight line. The lean startup completely flips this on its head. It replaces that big planning with experimentation, it swaps intuition for direct customer feedback, and it trades that linear execution for rapid, constant iteration. Now, the engine that drives this entire new approach is a really simple but incredibly powerful concept: the build, measure, learn feedback loop. So instead of just executing a plan, the real goal is to cycle through this loop as fast as you possibly can to find a business model that actually works.
So how does it work? Simple. First, you build a minimum viable product, an MVP. This is the most basic version of your idea you can create to start learning. Then you measure. You get that MVP in front of real customers and see what they actually do, not what they say they'll do. And finally, you learn from that data. You figure out if your strategy is working and you should persevere, or if you need to pivot and make a big change in direction.
Now, I know this might sound a little bit like pure theory, but it's the exact process that some of the most successful companies of the last decade have used to find their way. So let's look at how this plays out in the real world.
Two absolutely fantastic examples are Dropbox and Uber. Both of them jumped into markets with huge uncertainty, and both of them use this lean approach to navigate it instead of trying to rely on some traditional, detailed business plan. Dropbox, they didn't even build a product at first. Their MVP was just a simple video explaining what their idea was. But when signups absolutely exploded, they knew they'd validated their core hypothesis. And Uber, it started as this super bare-bones app for just the founders and a few of their friends, and they slowly added features based on what they learned from actually using it. Both of these companies literally learned their way to success. So, what's the big takeaway from all of this? Well, the way we think about strategy has gone through this fundamental shift. It's moved from being a rigid document to being a living, breathing process.
When you get right down to it, this is about two completely different mindsets. The old blueprint was all about flawless execution. Success meant you hit your budget, you hit your schedule. But this new compass, it's all about rapid learning. Success is measured by validated feedback you get from actual customers, and it totally reframes failure. It's not something to be avoided anymore, but a necessary, even valuable part of the process. The most important currency in modern strategy isn't capital, it's how fast you can learn. And that really leaves us with one final question to think about. Whether you're running a startup or a team inside a huge company, is your strategy a detailed blueprint designed for a world you think is predictable? Or is it a compass designed to help you find your way through the unknown? The answer just might make all the difference.